Let's go. Welcome, everyone. I'm Mathilde Gaston-Maté. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach for DAI's European Business. I'm really happy to welcome you today for this discussion on COVID-19 recovery in fragile and conflict-affected countries. I'll just give you a little bit of background in case this is your first DAI ECDPM webinar. So about us first, DAI is a global development company. We have over 50 years of experience working with different types of clients, from donors to government or private companies. And on the other side is the ECDPM, the European Centre for Development Policy Management, a global think and do tank, working on sustainable development policies and practices. DAI and ECDPM are longtime partners and friends. Last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, after some discussions with San Bilan of ECDPM, which I'm sure some of you know, we decided to join forces for webinars that would bring together public and private practitioners to reflect on the immediate reaction of the development community and to support the EU's global response to the crisis. And this first webinar series was really successful in terms of participation, but also we learned a lot from it. So 1 year later, we decided to carry on exploring the impact, but also the opportunities of the pandemic on global development in general, and of course, in particular, on the European agenda for international partnerships. So today's session is the last actually before the summer break, and we'll start again in September with 3 more sessions focusing on development finance, on the Green Deal, and on women's economic empowerment. And I will now leave the floor to Lidet Tadesse, your facilitator for today's session. She will introduce the topic and the speakers, and we will start the discussion. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this webinar.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. This session indeed is on COVID-19 recovery in fragile and conflict-affected countries. And the reason why we chose this topic is because, you know, at this point, we're all talking about COVID recovery. But of course, what is the experiences of fragile and conflict-affected countries with COVID, but also with their recovery, is going to be very different from how other contexts are recovering from COVID. So we thought focusing in on the experiences and needs and some of the lessons learned on how some states that are affected by conflict or are fragile are responding to COVID would be a good idea, and will offer some lessons on how recovery is done in contexts where state capacity is limited or where conflict might still be an impediment. So it is in that light that we chose this topic. And for that, we have a brilliant lineup of speakers that come in from different sectors or bring in different and diverse insights to the topic. But before I introduce the speakers, allow me to say a few housekeeping rules or housekeeping notes. One is to make this point that what we'd like to do with this session is have an interactive discussion. So we haven't asked the speakers to prepare presentations, so you won't be bored. The second point is because we would, you know, in the spirit of discussions, we would also like to hear from you. We invite you to ask your questions and make your comments, but we ask you to use the chat function in this platform and write down the questions and comments that you have, and I will relay those to the speakers, or the speakers could also respond to them as part of their interventions or as part of their insights. And then the third point is, because we are recording this session, I'd really like to ask if all of you could mute your microphones and switch off your videos. So this is for those that are not speakers, please switch off your mics and also videos. This just helps us for the recording. Okay, so with that, allow me to introduce our speakers. We have 4 speakers. We have Benoit Lariel, Benoit works in the EU delegation to Somalia, but he's joining us in his personal capacity. So what he says is not attributable to the EU delegation. We just wanted to hear of his experiences there. Benoit manages the private sector development aspect of the EU delegation's work in Somalia. The other speaker, also from Somalia, is Abdullahi Osman. Abdullahi is the Chief Executive Officer of Hormoud Foundation. Hormoud is the biggest telecom company in Somalia and very much a household name throughout the country. Then we have Rick Goodman. Rick is a Director of Resilience Technical Services at DAI, and he has extensive experience in conflict-affected contexts. And Rick will be talking to us about he'll be talking to us about social protection in conflict-affected contexts. And then our last but not least, we have Aude de Montesquieu. Aude is the Senior Advisor for Strategy and Scaling Economic Inclusion through Digital Innovations. She works at the BRAC Institute for Governance and Development. Aude is one of the leading authors of World Bank's State of Economic Inclusion report. She'll have a lot to say about economic inclusion in conflict-affected countries, in fragile and conflict-affected countries. So these are the speakers that we have for today. To start off with the discussion, I'll maybe ask all of the panelists a few questions, and I'll maybe start with Aude. So Aude, you've recently worked on the World Bank Economic Inclusion Report. You've been working on this report for some years now, and I wanted to ask if you could tell us a few things about your work on economic inclusion and the place and prospects of economic inclusion programs in fragile and conflict-affected countries. What's different about doing economic inclusion in fragile and conflict-affected countries?
Thank you, Lidet, and it's a great pleasure to be here on the panel. So first, what do we mean when, you and I say economic inclusion, but a lot of people would say graduation type programs. And I just want to start by defining what we're talking about. What we mean here is deeply targeted programs that really are working with the extreme poor, that are at the household level, and that are offering a bundled set of interventions that are aimed towards increasing the assets and incomes of the poorest. These types of programs were developed by BRAC in Bangladesh about now 20 years ago. And when I was at CGAP, I was leading an effort by CGAP and the Ford Foundation to replicate the BRAC approach in 10 countries, in 10 sites in 8 countries. And the idea originally was really to do this type of thing in places that were secure, that had the basics needed for helping the poorest reach microfinance and become successful entrepreneurs. Originally, we didn't think this type of model could work in FCV types of settings. Now, last year, with former colleagues at the World Bank, we took a very, very comprehensive effort to look at the World Bank's portfolio of economic inclusion types programs. And what we found is over 200 types of programs in 75 different countries, reaching over 92 million people. One of the biggest takeaway and quite unexpected of this 2021 report is that the programs, 1 in 4 program is situated in an FCV country. And really what we're seeing is that the pipeline for this type of program is increasingly in fragile context. Sometimes coupled with a climate change and mitigation type of program. For example, we have a really interesting experience from UNHCR, who's implementing graduation type economic inclusion programs for the poorest refugees and IDPs in many locations, and they've created what they call the Poverty Coalition, which is trying to scale up these programs with partner NGOs in refugee settings. And then we also know through World Bank programs, including Afghanistan's Targeting the Ultra Poor program in 2 sites in Afghanistan, that these programs really can work in very fragile settings. Just to close my first remark is actually the findings from the Afghanistan pilot were evaluated by the World Bank's Evaluation Division, DAI, and they show higher impact, including on things like gender empowerment, than mainstream graduation programs. So it's very encouraging on the potential for these types of programs to help very poor people in fragile settings.
Yeah. Thank you, Aude. That's interesting because, you know, the kind of things that you're talking about graduating people out of poverty, let's say, and supporting the most vulnerable and the ones that are affected the most by poverty or other social ills, also relates very much to what Rick works on, that is social protection. So Rick, with this pandemic, I think we've all been reminded of the need to systematically and structurally support the most vulnerable segments of society. And we've, I think, been reminded of the need to also have, you know, social safety nets and some social frameworks that could provide support to people so that they could bounce back easily. I wanted to hear from you, if you could tell us a few things about how governments and then development partners as well have been able to put in place or adapt existing safety net programs to reach people, you know, who have been particularly affected by COVID, be it because of the health crisis that COVID has been, or be it because they have lost their livelihoods as a result of the measures that were put in place to control COVID. So what has been done so far, and how have they been adapting existing programs to provide social protection?
Yeah, thanks, Lidet. I mean, also a pleasure to participate in the discussion, and I'm also going to just, you know, like Aude, I'm going to start off with a definition of terms, and I hope I'm not teaching anybody to suck eggs. But you know, what is social protection? Not to attempt a comprehensive definition of this, but social protection is fundamentally a government-led intervention to help, the redistribution of available resources towards people who are, however you define them, poor and vulnerable, to help mitigate social inequality, to augment social cohesion, and ensure inclusion. There's certainly a moral case to do that. But the point I want to drive at is that this is fundamentally a political action, and one, in formulating a country or territory's social protection provision. This needs to take account of operational and technical and, importantly, political priorities. When state capacity is low, in extreme examples of fragile and conflict-affected states, the government tends to be absent or less influential in that discussion, and that leaves the UN, IFIs, and aid agencies to their own devices, and the political debate happens within the context of competition and collaboration between external actors, and it's just so important that governments are leading, are included, participating in that intervention. I think the big picture, the last 18 months through COVID, the big picture is that there has been a complete array of responses to the unforeseen crisis. This is the crisis that, well, some people foresaw it, but by and large it wasn't anticipated. The global consensus is that there has needed to be a counter-cyclical financial intervention, i.e., we are heading into a global recession by and large, where there are not the resources to provide surplus or return and redistribution, but this is precisely the moment to act in that regard and to provide additional resources to people who are both have pre-existing vulnerabilities, but of also the people in the informal economy, in precarious work, who've fallen out, who've fallen out of work, have probably fallen the furthest, and this is exposed not just this pre-existing caseload that we already knew about and have by and large registered and measured and included in such systems, but also those that were that were not included in social assistance or in social insurance schemes. And so the response has taken many forms in the UK, where I'm speaking from. We've seen furlough schemes promoted by government. We've seen home working. We've seen somewhat in response to popular campaigning rather than government initiative. We've seen extension of school feeding through school holidays. We've seen the acceptance of children of so-called key workers, essential staff, to continue attendance at school rather than fall back on homeschooling. Maybe quality of that homeschooling is under debate. And in more fragile contexts, of course, we've seen a huge array of initiatives from international aid organizations, and some positive signs and some kind of reluctance from host governments to respond to the challenge. Just to pick two examples, the government of Bangladesh increased the pre-primary and primary school stipend by a significant percentage, 25% of the stipend value, but it was a small value in the first place, so arguable impact at the end of the day. And it's only for 12 months. So whether, there's a question about whether that's going to have the impact, required in response to the pandemic. Uganda government refused to allow the implementation of an urban transfer at the end of last year, possibly because it was in the middle of an election campaign and its support base is more in rural areas than in urban. So here we already see the clashes and the issues that collide between the technical correct response and the political. But donor assistance also mixed. Many government aid agencies, France, Sweden, Germany notably, have increased the US has increased their aid spend while their GDP has fallen. Other countries, the UK most notably probably, has decided to cut its spend on international assistance more in line with the reduction of GDP over the last year. So, we've learned a lot about social protection programming and the ways to manage that. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that later on in the course of the program. But the big picture overall very positive, but very mixed political picture across the world.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. I mean, you touched on a lot of things that I want to come back to. But I was particularly struck by what you were saying about social protection being not just a technical issue, but also a political one. I also heard from you that social protection is very much government-centric. I mean, not in terms of who is the responsible actor to deploy or to put in place social protection programs. You place the government as the key entry actor to roll out social protection programs. But I want to ask Abdullahi, who is, of course, a person from the private sector, and who is one of the biggest companies, or who runs one of the biggest companies in Somalia, which is, a conflict-affected country, and where the state or the capacity and also presence of the state is quite limited. I wanted to understand, Abdullahi, from your experience in Somalia, on where you see the role of the private sector in the COVID recovery, because the state is not so capable, maybe not as capable as the private sector. How do you see the role of the private sector in COVID recovery in a context like Somalia? I think you're muted, Abdullahi.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I was muted. Thank you, Lidet. Also, I would like to extend my greetings to the organizers of this discussion, ECDPM and DAI, and also my fellow panelists. Actually, when we are talking about a COVID recovery, or actually addressing the challenges come up with the COVID, especially where the state is weak or where there is no state, is really very challenging and very daunting situation. By Hormuz Salam Foundation, which is the first corporate foundation in Somalia. It is the corporate foundation for Hormuz Telecom and Salam Somali Bank. The mission of the foundation is to provide a local support for local people. We have our slogan, which is local help for local people, which is promoting the local people, Somali people, to help themselves before they seek outside help. From actually dealing the situation where there is the state is weak, or where there is no actually, for example, the state, we developed it from the beginning a model of enabling humanitarian projects throughout our resources. I mean, Hormuz Telecom and Salam Somali Bank. Our local approach means we know where we need to target, especially to support where we need to target our support to benefit of Somali people. Our program are broad-ranging and include not exclusively the Al-Noor School for the Blind, which is the largest school for visually impaired children in Somalia. Also, we have Hormuz Telecom Annual Scholarship Program, Vocational Training School, Mogadishu Fire Brigade, Free Microfinance Program. When it comes to the COVID-19, actually we had to step in with full force. We have rebuilt a hospitals, provided necessary equipment such as PPE, oxygen cylinders. We have purchased oxygen plant to create self-sufficient supply oxygen in Somalia, which was the biggest challenge in Somalia. You can imagine where the state or the government is saying that we don't have oxygen, hospitals are running out of oxygen, and no one actually is helping. The government saying they don't have any resources at all. Hormuz Telecom, our parent company, has replaced it is almost nearly 4 million customers ringtones with up-to-date healthy announcements, public health awareness about the COVID-19. Also, we have launched the country's first COVID-19 call center, which gives callers direct access to medical professionals. Also, we have deployed our okay, 1 second. Also, we have deployed our engineers to repair the existing oxygen plants, private oxygen plants. So then, when the COVID-19 started in Somalia in the first wave, there was no single hospital which was able to deal or address the basic needs of the patients. So all those activities I'm talking about, we actually we set up for our own resources and all those free of charge. So actually operating and working, the other speakers were actually some addressing about the issue of accessibility, inclusion, or access services. But the challenge here in Somalia is quite a big difference. For example, we, as Hormuz Telecom, we are the biggest employer in the country compared to the state. According to the World Bank, 97% of the Somali economy depends on private sector, which means the public or the state has no role. So it's really very challenging and very difficult. And I think what's really needed is international community has been trying very hard to support Somalia, but still the challenges are so huge.
Yeah, thank you, Abdullahi. I mean, I hear from what you are saying that in a way, Hormuz and possibly other private sector actors have, with COVID, in order to respond to COVID, may have stepped into providing services that the state, classically speaking, that the state would have been expected to provide. So what I hear from you is that the private sector in a context like Somalia, where the state is quite limited or non-existent, where state penetration is limited, the private sector also performs some sort of state-like functions and provides services. But I was also quite impressed by what you said about Hormuz, for example, being the largest employer in Somalia, and also the data that you have there of 97% of employment being private sector led in Somalia. That, I mean, tells us a lot about how important the private sector is for the economy of Somalia, but also how active and quite central the private sector are for the general state functions or societal functions, actually. So this brings me to my question to Benoit, who also knows the Somalia context rather well, and whose work focuses on supporting private sector actors there. Abdullahi has told us that, you know, the private sector is quite active in Somalia, and the EU, of course, is one of the biggest financial partners for the Somali government, has quite a significant presence in Somalia. So I wanted to understand, Benoit, how is the EU trying to harness this private sector vitality in Somalia? How do you approach this?
Thank you, Lidet, and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to the participants. Thank you to ECDPM and DAI for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to participate to this conversation on such a fascinating topic. I think, yeah, you started discussing the role of private sector, your previous question, which is a very interesting one, and including how we see private sector in society, the role of private sector in society, and it's difficult to talk about private sector without talking about the state, which we have started also discussing. But yeah, we probably will have an opportunity to continue that specific conversation later. Now, to answer to your very specific question on the how we intend to, as EU, to work with private sector in Somalia and to achieve the economic recovery. Perhaps allow me to maybe to start by why engaging with private sector? Why do we see private sector as an important player? Well, first, as Abdullahi has indicated very well, indeed, private sector has been there. Private sector has delivered services, and including in absence of the states, and this for decades and decades. So there is a sort of resilience of private sector, as we are used to say. Of course, there are limitations to that. You cannot do everything, and you cannot solve all problems without a stable and effective state, basically. But still, indeed, even in the education and health sector, you see most services provided by private actors. So that's, I think, a very first reason. I would add to that there is, and I've basically noticed that in the many discussions, meeting I've had with the Somali people, is that there is a tremendous energy and a business mindset in Somalia. So I think the country would certainly qualify as an entrepreneurial country. Sometimes there are also downsides. Sometimes behind entrepreneurship, you see actually more opportunism, or sometimes lack of opportunities. People would like to basically to work for a big company like Hormuz, where they could have they could be offered good working conditions, but they, of course, Hormuz cannot solve all the employment problems of the country, so they have to find alternatives by themselves. So there's a lot of self-employment. So this is behind the disguise of entrepreneurship. But we could certainly also talk about that specifically later. A second reason why, or third reason why we also see private sector as a key actor is because the government itself has prioritized or see the development of Somalia as enterprise-led, as it's said in the National Development Plan. And we see that the government has embarked in a range of economic reforms to not only boost the traditional economic sectors, traditional value chains like livestock, fisheries, agriculture, but also with a strong push to diversify the economy and offer opportunities in other areas. And we see actually today that the service sector, for example, the telecom, but also the banks and many other hospitality, constructions, they increasingly contribute to the GDP in Somalia. So we see that indeed the economy is slowly but steadily diversifying. And this goes even beyond. The government is also pushing for a regional economic integration and even WTO accession. So there's been a lot of progress made on that in that area. Of course, the challenges are considerable, but there is certainly willingness and optimism. This, I think, is seen as in general as the way to create the many jobs that the country needs. And as you know, Somalia, like many other fragile countries, actually, they have a super young population, and Somalia probably one of the youngest population on the continent. So creating jobs is certainly we are all anxious to create all the jobs and offer opportunities to all these young people arriving on the labor market every year. Often informal labor market, but this enhancing the role of private sector will also contribute, and is contributing to also increase public revenue through taxation. So taxation remains only a very tiny part of public revenue. I think it's, yeah, I'm not sure about the figure, so I won't say anything, but it's only a small part, but it's growing. And so the objectives are there, and the progress is being made. So the EU is definitely as one of the key donors willing to contribute to that. Our framework as EU, probably some in the audience, because I think, as I understand, we have many development professionals. Our framework in that area is the EU External Investment Plan. So basically, in a nutshell, I will not go into the details, but in a nutshell, it's an approach based on providing financial assistance to support investments, technical assistance to provide the capacities or help building the capacities necessary to manage these investments, and enhancing the policy dialogue on the investment climate, so that the framework is more adequate or more conducive for such investments. In that framework, what we do in Somalia at the moment, we have a range of projects, and you'll see we'll also certainly discuss that in a fragile country. We need to be a bit comprehensive. We have to address many things at the same time. So in terms of in the private sector area, we provide access to finance, micro businesses, small producers, SMEs as well. We support the public-private dialogue and policy reforms in key sectors. There is a lot of work being done, and Abdullahi added in the infrastructure area, roads, ports, telecoms, etc. And we also support all business incubation, with a focus on women and youth, who are the most impacted or the most fragile in Somalia, but also the most affected by the COVID crisis. And for example, in terms of unemployment, so there is a strong emphasis on these target groups, if I can name them that way. In addition, I will finish with that. The EU is also contributing, supporting, together with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and IGAD actually as well, the Horn of Africa initiative, which has a focus on regional infrastructure, digital, roads, and energy. But not only. There is also this also includes an effort towards economic integration, trade, resilience, and human capital. So I have not mentioned humanitarian aid and or support to peace and stability, which are obviously super important as well. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Benoit. I mean, you and Abdullahi both, I guess, spoke a bit about the role of the private sector in a context like Somalia. But of course, the Somali experience could also be a unique one. But to go back to this need as a society or as countries organize themselves, the need to systematize and ensure that people who are most vulnerable in the poorest segments of society are not supported when the private sector sees the profit value, for example, but because they are really included in how the state apparatus is put in place, and yeah, just to make sure that they are not forgotten because their profit value is not very clear. Let me just go back to you, Rick, and also Odd, because I wanted to understand, maybe you could also make it clear for our participants on, you did explain what economic inclusion and also what social protection mean, but what makes social protection, Rick, maybe I could start from you, what makes social protection in conflict-affected countries or in fragile settings different from other social protection programs in other contexts, like low-income countries, for example, or middle-income countries? I mean, what are some of the specificities about thinking about social protection programs in fragile and conflict-affected countries? And I would basically ask Odd the same question, but about economic inclusion, after Rick gets to respond.
Gosh, how long have we got? That's a big question. So firstly, I'd like to really kind of salute and applaud Abdullahi and the Hormuz Foundation and other members of the business community in Somalia, and recognise that the commitment and solidarity that they have to return and support people in their society. The degree of poverty and inequality is, and there's not, I don't think there's a straightforward or even an established relationship between poverty and social protection spend, but it is recognizable that if a government doesn't invest in social services, social protection, health, education, social care, health systems, the degree of inequality and poverty will rise. You can see this very clearly over time in many contexts. I have in mind a particular country, where I'm sitting as an example of this, which left the country much more vulnerable and exposed to unforeseen shocks as a consequence, and we're living with that. It's great. It's as I said, it's fantastic that the private sector are creating foundations, and in charities, NGOs, foundations are supporting social need in the absence of an organized central system. But ultimately, I think in my mind, the model that we need to aspire to is one when and there is enough revenue generated to provide taxes from corporations and from individuals. That tax is collected and held in common by a form of representative entity, normally called a government, and there is a consensus agreement, a social contract about how much of that money is spent on social services and mitigating impact of inequality and poverty, right? And so that, in my vision, that is the direction of travel that we need to aspire to. It's not that there is, there's not a role for for charity and NGOs and foundations, but that there certainly should be an increased role for government in that democratic model. Without that relationship between citizens voting in their governments on a particular platform of manifesto, and then holding those representatives accountable for delivery on that system. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm going into a lecture about democracy and governance rather than social protection here. So in the absence of a strong central authority state to play that role in delivering on the social contract, it is somewhat left to international aid agencies, and in the case of Somalia, the private sector, to step into that role. But they are doing that in the absence, in the vacuum of a political framework and set of priorities, participated in by citizens or those that are franchised to vote for their representatives. So that's the theory. Maybe Ord can ground that in some more practical reality for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Just building on what you said, Lidet's question about what's different in FCV settings. I mean, my first comment would be that, I mean, at least the programs I've worked with, social protection programs in FCV settings, have been mostly delivered by humanitarian aid agencies or the UN system. And with that they fit under less of a kind of promotive type of framework as a government would have, but more under a protection mandate. I've worked quite extensively with UNHCR, where really social protection and economic inclusion fits within their protection framework. And what's very important here is to say that interventions like economic inclusion / graduation programs that are building on regular cash transfers, be they government or humanitarian cash transfers, really need to be seen as participating to this protection framework, and really that the actual building of refugee or displaced people or fragile context, building self-reliance in those contexts, is really advancing the protection mandate of these humanitarian aid agencies. To be more concrete, just on what's different between economic inclusion intervention in a context, like in a regular context, less fragile, and a more fragile context, what we've seen is much more emphasis on some of the psychosocial dimensions, meaning the coaching might have more of a kind of psychosocial training. There might be more emphasis on gender-based violence prevention, and sometimes there is more of a legal rights and right to work, etc., like a more of a legal aspect built onto a regular economic inclusion program. Yeah, and just to kind of put it in a slightly more positive stance than what Rick was saying, is also I've seen cases where in FCV settings, the social protection programs were actually quite state of the art, and where the government was actually trying to catch up with the humanitarian systems in terms of efficiency of the way the aid is delivered, and actually the size of the transfers. But that might be an exception, but still it's worth noting.
Yeah, thanks, Odd. I mean, picking up from what you and Rick were saying about, responding or rolling out social protection programs or social inclusion programs in the context of fragile and conflict-affected countries, you did touch on the role of international partners, for example, because they happen to be the ones that either integrated as part of their other work, or because of funding gaps, sort of step in to provide the necessary funding for that. But I wanted us to maybe talk about this, talk about conflict-affected countries, and then focus in for a minute on COVID and what sorts of adaptations have been done to economic inclusion programs, to social protection programs, but also the way in which the private sector has been responding, or the ways in which the private sector also works in conflict-affected countries in response to COVID-19. And maybe I could come to you, Benoit, and ask you, in relation to COVID-19 and the recovery therein, how has the EU as a development partner, in what ways have you been able to adapt your work? In what ways have you had to change the way in which you engage the private sector for COVID response, perhaps differently from how you were engaging with them before COVID? What are some of the adaptations and lessons learned for you?
Actually, there's perhaps I'd like maybe to start to build on what Rick and Odd have been saying about, in particular in relation to the social contract question. And I think that definitely I also see that obviously a social contract in partner countries is also needed there to have basically to it's the basis for consensus and for taking the most adequate decisions. However, especially in fragile in partner countries that are fragile and conflict prone, the task is considerable. It's not unlike in Europe, for example, where our governments have been able to mobilize a huge amount of money to support the economic recovery, provide the social protection, and this in an atmosphere of dialogue among stakeholders, political parties within government. Whereas in fragile countries, at least in Somalia, we have multiple crises and shocks at the same time. We have had COVID that has just been one more layer above droughts, locust invasion, floods, and obviously also the lack of security in some regions, at least, and 3 million IDPs in the country. So they've had to manage all that at the same time. So it's really extremely challenging then for the country, for the stakeholders in the country, for the citizens, the state to focus on a social contract. And they have also huge financing needs, unmet financing needs. And I think the question I also see is that whether our solidarity with these countries, is it sufficient? And although Europe has been probably leading the effort in terms of support access to vaccination through the COVAX facility, but also exporting vaccines through its new Global Europe Fund, is it enough? And I think that's certainly a key question for all development professionals. I think, and it's not only the volume; it's also the mechanism, the modalities, and the timing. Because of course, the effects of COVID are today. Well, COVID and the other shocks, they are today. So coming up with a response in 2 years might be too late unfortunately for many people. And to broaden the discussion, I think I would like to make a link maybe with the SDG. As far as I know, many countries are off track to achieve the SDG by 2030. We need more investment finance to achieve these goals. It will be extremely difficult for the highly indebted countries, although some are progressing well, and including Somalia, which is negotiating its debt relief, and there are positive signals. But overall, we see a huge financing gap. So including for financing the private sector contribution to this effort. And I think a question that is being discussed is: do we have the adequate the sufficient and adequate financial resources to support that? So I think while there is an effort in the partner countries that need to be made, we cannot do it on their behalf. But also, I think we really need at this period in time, a significant, sustained international solidarity at global level to achieve these goals, overcome the challenges. Otherwise, what we will see is that the incumbents will have their position reinforced. There will be more unemployment, and private sector will continue to at least to try to fill in the void left by the state, but to the extent that it can, and while with a lot of inefficiencies along the road, probably. But yeah, that's maybe a bit a gloomy picture. But at the same time, we see, as I said, positive signals. And Somalia, for example, is renegotiating, is discussing and making progress with international financial institutions, and economic reforms are underway, as I also said. So the overall picture is not black or white, but gray. Now, if I still have time, I have to answer to your questions. Or would you like to shift to something else?
Let me just because you raised very interesting points, and for me, the one takeaway and like very catchy statement that you had in there is solidarity enough to respond to the needs of a country like Somalia? And I would imagine Abdullahi saying no solidarity is not enough. That is why the private sector is out there doing things, as you also acknowledged and he was sharing with us earlier. So maybe Abdullahi, and a lot of the other speakers had also talked about social contracts and how, in the case of Somalia, that is, you know, like a an idea that we can't really, at least at this point, the way things stand, the social contract between the government or the state and the people is rather weak. But let us maybe talk about the private sector, what the private sector has been doing, and how in the response to COVID-19, Abdullahi, you mentioned a couple of activities that Hormud has been doing to respond to COVID-19. But I wanted to ask you if you could share with us some of your reflections on whether or not responding to COVID has changed the relationship between the private sector and society writ large, for example. That's not a social contract per se, but that is indeed a relationship that is quite important in the context of Somalia. So has there, while responding to COVID, has that changed how the private sector is perceived, how people relate to the private sector? You can speak specifically to Hormud, but has that changed, or is it like what Benoit was saying earlier, that, you know, in Somalia, some sort of crisis, be it a security crisis, environmental, or others, are known, and the private sector has always been responding to those. So COVID hasn't really particularly changed the ways in which the private sector has been relating to the society. What are your thoughts there?
Thank you. A Somalia democracy is still in its infancy. Therefore, we need to continue to rely on domestic and international support. In a fragile state, it's important to support all the. It's important to work all the players toward making Somalia more stable. Also, I'm very grateful and thank for international community support to Somalia for many years, and I hope that they will continue their support to provide Somalia with greater capacity, as it is very difficult in the early stages of our development to support ourselves. Somali people live below the extreme poverty line. So Somalia cannot itself support at the moment. There are many challenges in Somalia, including poor infrastructure. Even the Somali taxation law is outdated. There is no tax regime in Somalia until now. There is no a tax harmonization in the country, as this country is in a federal state, in federal system. Huge insecurity, but still Somali people, but still Somalia is thriving as a country where the people will continue to live their lives and remain resourceful. It's important that the international community see this potential in Somalia. For a state to exist, it must be supported by the thriving private sector. For private sector to exist, it must be supported by the foundation of the state. Somalia, we are developing a together, and thank you to the support of our international partners. We ask that the world comes out of the coronavirus pandemic and not to leave Somalia behind. For example, for Hormuz, we are actually doing humanitarian programs, plus developmental programs. All the projects invested by Hormuz Group have a specific aims. One, to address a challenge or pressing need, to create jobs, and to facilitate the rebuilding of the country. As the largest telecommunication provider, Hormuz Telecom is instrumental to the Somali economy, providing the telco and internet network its need to communicate. The mobile money platform, EVC Plus, is very important for the Somali economy. In 2019, I was on a panel with a former UK ambassador to Somalia, and he said that he had never seen before a public service as important as Mood Telecom's AVC Plus. He noted the positive impact the platform has had on the lives of Somali women because they are the largest recipient of cash aid. I prefer to receive this model for a direct support. Even the mobile money services here in Somalia contributed to the Somalia economy. And also it actually contributed to prevent the inflation rates in Somalia. As a company, we are committed to the implementation of a compliant and regulatory infrastructure essential to any thriving and developing economy. In February, Mood Telecom was awarded the country's first mobile money license by the Somali Central Bank. For example, our response to the COVID-19 or our intervention is how it shaped the relationship between the private sector and the state and the Somali public. I remember actually I was as a member of the Somali COVID-19 a national committee of Somali a COVID-19 national task force. We had on a daily basis communications and connections between as a foundation and the government and between we and the public. That intervention actually created a closeness between us and in Somali government, Somali federal member states, and Somali people. And Mood Telecom operates 11 regions out of the 18 regions in Somalia, or South Central Somalia, which is the most volatile parts of the country. We actually operate under different 5 administrations plus federal member states. We have to pay each of them a tax. In exchange, the government or the federal member state, they are not in a position to provide any services or protection at all. And Mood Telecom is the largest taxpayer to the Somali government. And even sometimes we pay more than what actually we are expected. In order to make Somalia a better place to live, we are very, very much grateful the support of the international community, especially the United States, the European Union, the UK. They are plus Australia and Japan. They are actually those who are supporting Somalia very actually generous. And I actually appeal to the international community to continue some of that support. We need more assistance and engagement, especially during this difficult time. I mean, this pandemic. The first wave, the support or the assistance from the international community was actually very great. But the second wave, the situation was really challenging and daunting, and even we may expect a third wave to hit here in Somalia. Still, Somalia has the infrastructure are not in a position to respond to these challenges. We, as a private sector, we are trying our best, and we are side with our people, but we need international community to do more.
Thank you, Abdullahi. I guess the thing that I take from your intervention, and maybe Aude, you could also say a few things about this is, of course, Abdullahi, your company provides telecom services, and this reminds me of the role of digital technology, the role of telecom services in sort of expediting or facilitating cash transfers, for example, or other sorts of services for the poorest segments of the society. And maybe, Aude, maybe you could say a few things about how you see the role of digitalization or digital technologies, and how do they relate to social inclusion programs? Have they, because of digitalization, have social inclusion programs, have they been able to operate differently in COVID response?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think it's not differently, but definitely the COVID crisis is acting as an accelerator in terms of digitizing programs that we're already digitizing. As Rick mentioned, and as we know, social protection, traditional social protection programs are already moving to digital, digitizing massively, both in terms of the actual on taking of people through social registries, beneficiary registries and government databases, etc., but also in terms of delivering through G2P cash transfers, government to people cash transfers, digital platforms, pushing out the money, and also sometimes allowing people to save on these digital platforms. What we're seeing in terms of economic inclusion programs is when you're adding this big push productive package for very poor people who are already receiving a cash transfer, it's very important, if you can, to also make sure that the transfer is made digitally and adds to the person's kind of digital financial inclusion, meaning that if the person already has a digital bank account, if they're already receiving a stipend or a cash transfer, then if you're making a large lump sum cash transfer, you can make it on the digital, you can make it digital and add to the person's digital wallet, etc. The innovations for us, and this is an agenda that I'm leading from at BRAC Institute for Governance and Development, is that we're also really seeing the potential for digital technologies to lower the cost of graduation type economic inclusion programs, but also potentially enhance the impact of these programs. And here we're talking about two things, at the front end, how can you use your phone to actually help push out your content to people, meaning can you actually have some trainings that use videos, or can you push out text messages reinforcing your program components, etc.? Can you build behavioral insights into the way that you're pushing out nudges to participants? But also at the back end for program management, can you actually digitize your monitoring system? Can you use predictive analytics that can help you as a program coach? When you visit households, you might have a notification that tells you this woman seems like she's falling behind as compared to her neighbors, or this person as compared to herself in the previous months, she looks like she might be declining, etc., in her livelihood. And so those types of predictive analytics, AI-informed models can really help program delivery become much more efficient. So right now, I'm monitoring a series of grants that are looking at different innovations in this area, both at the front end and at the back end. How can you really enhance the program delivery through digital technologies?
Thanks, Aude. So there are some questions in the chat box, but I saw that Benoit and you, Aude, you've responded to a lot of them. Maybe one where you may not have responded to has to do with access to finance, particularly for poor people that may not have collateral. I don't know if Aude, you want to respond to that, or if other people want to take that on.
I'm happy to.
Yeah.
I tried to respond a bit to that, but to say that in my view, in FCV context, you know, a graduation program, and that was a previous question I tried to answer in the chat, but basically the idea of these graduation/economic inclusion programs is to provide a bundled set of interventions that really help people move from extreme vulnerability into productive activities. In this, typically you will have consumption support to kind of smoothen people's immediate consumption needs, and that often is the government cash transfer if there is one, or a humanitarian cash transfer, and then access to financial services, plus a lump sum cash transfer or productive transfer and careful coaching. In the access to financial services part, early evidence, including from a USAID study in Ethiopia, really shows that the actual access to savings is really crucial in terms of helping people build resilience. The fact that people have a safe place to save their money is really the most essential one of the most essential parts of this type of model to build resilience.
Okay, thanks, Odd. We are coming towards the end of our session, but before I ask you for your last remarks, maybe Benoit, you can help us understand one last question very quickly, which is, how do you get financial institutions and development financial institutions to actively leverage private sector for inclusive projects? How does this work in a context like Somalia, or in fragile context? You could quickly respond to this, and then I can ask you for your last input, and then we can wrap up.
Yes, a pleasure. On the question related to the DFI and IFIs, the approach that we are following in Somalia is, it's not just us, the EU, it's with all the development partners, and the IMF and the World Bank certainly play a central role in this. There has been a lot of work for many years to, as I mentioned earlier, to get to the debt relief for Somalia, and there is a roadmap of reforms to ensure that there is a strong management, public management, basically in place. This debt relief will then open the door for financial institutions coming in, if I can say. And actually, this door is already half open, actually, so that it's unlocking some. And I think it's one of the major obstacles for many international financial institutions, and this door now is already half open. But it's still work ongoing, and in parallel to that, there is a whole effort, a joint effort involving the Somali private sector, the Somali banks, government, and development partners, to help the Somali financial sector to get up to the international standards, international financial and corporate standards. So this will certainly facilitate international bank corresponding banking and transfer payments at international level. However, all this is again quite a long-term effort. So the approach privileged by the EU is at the same time to facilitate, unlock the immediate obstacles faced by those financial institutions, DFIs, that are interested, willing, or already making some investments in Somalia, but they have a lack of there's a lack of data. They don't know the market very well, the stakeholders. And so they need some studies or preparatory works to be done. So this will help, basically will enable some investments to a limited extent, but at least to have something happening now, basically. But in addition to that, I think there is another level of work that is being done, or still needs to be done, is a more and it's probably more with the headquarters that it should be done. Is a reflection on the risk appetite of financial institutions, because at the end they are banks. They're looking for a return. Okay, it's not only financial return. They're also looking for social impact, but still there is a return at the end, and so there is a financial risk appetite. There is also reputational risk that issue. So. And that's when I mentioned earlier that when I was referring to this adequate financial resources is whether basically the way we manage our risk are adequate to that type of environment. Perhaps there are ways to cover these risks in new ways. I'm not an expert, I don't know, but I presume there's something to be done.
Okay,
and
thanks,
to
Benoit.
finish,
Yeah, okay, finish, yes.
in one sentence, to help to encourage financial DFIs to engage in a country or to invest in a country like Somalia. I think us public institutions, we have the instruments, we have the funding that we can provide them. They'll manage it, but they use basically all public money to initiate investments. And the EU has the guarantee instruments, the external guarantee instruments to do that at global level. So I think we are equipped.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. That's those are very interesting points. And just for the broader audience as well, this is a topic, or finance in fragile and conflict affected countries is a topic that we at ECDPM are exploring. So if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, please do, so that you can follow up with some of our work, and we can keep you posted on where we have reached with that research. Having said that, because now we are actually 1 minute behind our schedule, let me just ask all of you to just give me, I don't know, your last remarks in very short and succinct manner, let's say in 30 seconds, so that the audience has main takeaways when the session ends. Rick, maybe I can start with you.
Sure, thank you, Lidet. So I mean, just to summarize by picking out one topic that the pandemic has taught us relevant to this discussion is the importance of risk management, to prepare for systemic risk. This serves the political stability, social cohesion, and private sector's interests and role in that mix. But this, a crisis is not the time to figure things out. It needs to be clear well ahead of time who is responsible for what the policy priorities are, who's going to pay for the crisis when it comes about, to make sure that we've got solid identity systems, financial and digital inclusion, definitions, management information systems, and prior registration. Just the last point to recognise that one of the roles of social protection is to enable and assist those that can to move into employment and off benefits. It shouldn't be a kind of a one-way street. There also needs to be a safety net and a fallback position. But it's very much, it doesn't create dependency and laziness. It's very much there to promote independence and economic activity. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. And Odd, your takeaway message?
Yeah, well, just actually very much building on what we've heard, but the idea that you're really helping very poor people build assets and incomes in an adapted way to an FCV setting is actually really crucial to helping them build self-reliance, resilience, and maintain dignity. Very much against this idea of laziness, but really maintain dignity and become self-reliant in a fragile and conflict-affected context. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Abdullahi, your last takeaway point.
Thank you. When I was actually making my previous comment, I acknowledged those who has been helping Somalia, but I left to mention that a UK government, as they now left it from the European Union, they've been very generous to the Somalia cause. Actually, Somali people, especially Somali private sector, has shown one of the most resilient people in the world. So we have been really working very a challenging environment, very difficulty some doing business, not easy doing business environment, and still we are able to survive and to make business and to be able to support our people. So my actually word would be that the international community support to Somalia is very crucial as it used to be in the past. But as a private sector, we are actually are ready to be proactive in terms of supporting Somalia and to make Somalia a better place to live. As we know, this year Somalia is supposed to get 3 million doses for the vaccinations, but so far 300, I think it's about 500 doses has arrived. So so bear in mind that we need to get more vaccination as well for Somalia. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and Benoit?
Yeah, I think to get out of this COVID crisis, a necessary condition, it will not be sufficient, but a necessary condition now is to provide vaccines to the people. But to do that, we also need to look at what's going on the ground. And from my perspective, what I see is that there is a lack of awareness among populations in many countries, a lack of trust regarding vaccination, and I also see that there are unofficial vaccine distribution networks, and that's also a reality that we have to manage if we want people to be vaccinated quickly. Otherwise, economic recovery will remain at some distance.
Excellent. Okay. Very interesting discussion. So many insightful points. Thank you so much for making time, everyone. Not only the speakers, but also the participants who have been listening, and then who have also been putting forth some of their questions in the chat box. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you our esteemed speakers in particular, who have been very active responding to each other's comments and questions as well, and informing us and sharing with us their reflections. With this, it has now, we're way over time, so I would have to close the discussion. It doesn't mean this is where the conversation ends. I hope some of you have already seen you've started exchanging email addresses, so let's keep the conversation going. Again, if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, please go ahead and do so on our website, so that you can keep abreast of our publications, including on this topic. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a nice evening to all of you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Benoit. Bye, Rick.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao, Abdullahi. Od, bye.